Hello, I'm Amanda Ernsberger, and I'm here to talk about my field observation for EDU 444. So my field observation was in Butte, Montana, and I was at the junior high there, and I actually was jumped around over 12 classes, and each class was dramatically different, and each class had a dramatically different layout. One of the key factors I noticed was that the layouts that were traditional seemed to have the most chaos in the classroom. The ones that were less traditional, such as tables instead of desks, were a lot less chaotic. So the first class I went to was a social studies class. The teacher took roll call before the class started, and there was no bell ringer, so the kids just got into class and instantly erupted into chaos. There appeared to be no seating chart because he just called out the names of the students, and the students had answered sporadically from different areas depending on where they were. His objectives were not clearly stated, and there weren't any classroom rules that I could see up on the walls. It was pretty much just social study related facts. There were some newspaper clippings to show that he did go to student events and look at things from the student's point of view. I did like how he started after roll call. He'd start with 10 minutes of news, so the students could see what's happening in the world. And it was a very interesting site called 10-Minute News. So it was all of the key points that happened the day before condensed into 10 minutes. Every so often, a student would begin acting up and talking loudly, and his response to discipline and curb that was to yell at the student and then punish the whole class for the fault of one. By the end of the week I was there, the class that I was observing actually lost their 10-minute news privilege for the day. The next class that I went to was a science class, and that was a non-traditional layout. So instead of having rows upon rows of desks, she had tables where two students were sitting at. That class had clearly stated objectives on the board, and then it had the lesson for the day on the board too, which was something that I really enjoyed. They also had a bell ringer, so they would come into class and then they would immediately get out a worksheet or answer questions, so they're not all just chaotic. There was also a seating chart, which she adjusted depending on the students too. So one of the students was acting up because she had been gone for a little while, so the teacher moved her to a different seat and adjusted it on her seating chart. The next class I went to was a reading class. It was an interesting concept at this school that their reading class and their literature class were two separate classes. So the reading class focused on books and how to read books and how to understand the concepts going into the books. This classroom was also set up in a non-traditional way. There were a lot of informative posters on the wall too, telling you what a metaphor was and what a theme was. And there was even posters based on the book that they were reading that the students made themselves, so that way they can refer back to it when they get stuck on a point when they're trying to figure out the theme for a chapter. This class did have assigned seating, and it was a lot less chaotic, and they also had a bell ringer. So before the bell rang, the moment they walked in, they had something to do. After that, I went to a math class, and I was super excited about this math class because it was a flipped classroom. I had not seen a flipped classroom before, and they were straight up just going right to their homework. They didn't have a bell ringer. The objectives it was a month-long objective calendar. So for all of her math classes, the objectives for the day and what was due the days was all set up and ready for the students to see. But for the flipped classroom students, they were able to go past the original lessons. So a couple of them actually got to the end of the math book and finished the math book by the time I got there. So she's been trying to get the next grade's math book so that way they can go even further. What I learned in that class was that a flipped classroom is hard at first, but eventually gets to the point where the classroom almost manages itself. But there is an issue. Some students can't handle a flipped classroom and they get all chaotic. She said that the class that I was in, that was the only class that she would recommend for a flipped classroom because the next class was bigger and it had more students that didn't want to do math. But overall, she said that it was worth the effort to do a flipped classroom at least once because it helps the students gain independent skills because they're responsible for their own grade. After that class is when I started jumping around various classes. So I went to a science class that was all a different teacher's science class that was set up in an interesting way. They did have the non-traditional desks, but the students moved their desks even after that so that way they can all circle around the teacher as she was explaining the projects that they were going over. They were doing the dissections, and to prepare them to dissect frogs and bigger things, they were dissecting a pickle. So they were cutting it open and removing the seeds one by one. And the rules were stated clearly. The classroom was bright, the windows open because it was a nice day. The walls weren't cluttered like the first class science classroom that I was in, where it had the informational stuff on the wall and the objectives, everything was able to be seen, but there was a lot of other stuff. There were plants, there were posters that didn't relate really to the subject. But even while listening to the class, I could hear the respect that they had for this teacher. She treated them equally and they really enjoyed it. The next class that I went to off of that day was another English class. This was an English class for higher grade students, and it was interesting because the teacher was non-traditional as well. She had her students, the desks were in the rows, but she had her students get up and sing and dance in order to remember the conjunctions and the prepositions and the definitions of prepositions, and the students really seemed to enjoy that. I also went to a Title I class. Now, the teacher was enthusiastic and everything, and there was a lot of quiet, which was unexpected for a Tier 1 class because before the Tier 1, I had also gone to a remedial title math class, which was just super chaotic and none of the kids wanted to be there. But the kids in the Title I class for English did want to be there. So they were quiet and they were actually writing out stories, which the teacher had said was advanced even for a Title I class. The last class I went to, well, the second to last class I went to was the literature class. So the literature class didn't have anything to do with books, but had to do with writing styles. It was this teacher's first year, and he was actually pretty excited that someone was going to observe his class. He was talking about how he had to juggle not having his students read a book and then write a paper based upon that book, but instead having to learn how to write out a paper. And so the paper they were working on was actually how to write a paragraph papers. So you start with the title and then the main thing. And he went through the steps by steps, and each student had to write out the steps in their own words, in their own definition. He was talking about how he had to figure out something else because the class went faster than he expected, that they excelled on writing papers and went above and beyond his expectations. So he got to the point where he was trying to figure out short stories or poems that he can use to get the kids ready for writing papers on books. The last class I did, which I really enjoyed, was a special ed class. And it was interesting the way the teacher had that classroom laid out. They were pretty busy because they were going to be putting together a school stay-in for the high school students to come and tell the junior high students what to expect. So the classroom was a little cluttered, but you can still see the flow of the classroom. So she had a short row of desks, but she had it separated so that way there was also a quiet corner and a few computers all separated by dividers, so that way the students can have different areas if they need it. Small thing I noticed in a lot of the classrooms that seemed to have the best management and the less chaos, they had refrigerators in them and actually had stuff for the students to eat or buy food. And I believe that's because of what Wong said in his book and in the videos, was that students like to feel part of a family, and a teacher is somewhat like a family, so if they feel safe in the classroom, like it's a more friendly environment, then they seem to excel and treat the classroom with respect more.